I really didn't want to have to make this video. This is what I would say if I didn't want to make this video. I do want to make this video. That's why I made it. Anyway, Mother 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. I like to think that I've made that abundantly clear on my channel. In fact, it's probably a little much, right? Well, even if you disagree, you're right. I do talk about Mother 3 too much. So here we are on the 1-year anniversary of the day I first played Mother 3, and the day it first struck me so potently. I'm here to talk about every issue I have with it to atone for my sins of being a massive fan. Never say that Arcade and Everlasting was overzealous about the positive qualities of Mother 3. Let's begin with some of the smaller issues because I don't really want to seem too nitpicky at the end. Gotta have a gradual pace here. So, small potato stuff. What do I find minorly annoying about Mother 3? Well, I really don't like the battle presentation. The Overworld presentation? Fantastic. But I just don't like fighting against the static sprites in battles, especially when there are recolors. This isn't nearly as noticeable here as it is in the first two Mother games, but it's still a problem. Like, I've already seen this enemy before. Why am I seeing it again, just a shiny version? Speaking of the sprite work though, let's look at the Overworld. There are so many fantastic sprites and animations, until there isn't. At some point around Chapter 7, the NPC sprites just sort of stop being introduced. Why? I genuinely don't know. They just really start to phone it in on that front. The backgrounds stay great though, way up until the end of the game. Good work, background team, you really nailed it. Musically speaking, Mother 3 has a gorgeous soundtrack. You've probably heard a lot of the great songs in Super Smash Bros., where they feature prominently. The only real problem I have here is, how does leitmotif play into this game's storytelling? You might be wondering what I mean, like, for example, Porky in particular has a very strong leitmotif, and I think it was narratively implemented very well in a consistent fashion. It follows him around throughout the entire game and his legions and the various corruptions he spreads. But then you have stuff like the sorrowful Tazmily leitmotif, the song that plays when the town is mourning Hinawa's death, which becomes associated with Duster for some reason. Or Unfounded Revenge, which gets reused a few times by a few different enemies like the Pork Trooper and Facade. Similarly, we have Strong One, which is used for several fights arbitrarily as well, from the Barrier Trio to Negative Man to the Masked Man. What do these have in common? Negative Man isn't a strong enemy, so you can't just say, well, it's just the strong enemy song. Monkey's delivery service is in the theme of one of the final bosses. The last one is explained by it being the leitmotif of Tazmily Village during production, but I honestly don't really care because the final product had all traces of that totally removed for an indiscernible reason. That's a piece of storytelling no player will pick up on unless they know the development history of that particular song. Now, time to talk about the gameplay, which is again pretty solid all the way through. The level curve is a little weird, but overall a good time. I don't remember a single segment of the game where I had to grind. You just need to strategize with your PSI and skills to win the upper hand. However, the music combo system is very difficult to get right. At first I thought it was a symptom of emulation, because that is input lag, which certainly doesn't help, but it's not just that. It's just not a very intuitive system, which I found out while playing the game on original hardware. Luckily, it's not necessary to complete the game. I really like the idea, and I think if there was ever a Mother 4, it's worth revisiting. Finally, let's talk about the story. This is going to be the meat of the video, and I want to get the sillier stuff out of the way first. Now, again, I love Mother 3. It's one of my favorite games of all time, but a lot of people call it some perfect masterpiece or the greatest story ever told, and that's just simply, a silly opinion, I suppose. I mean, I can't really tell you otherwise, because the quality of art is different for every individual, but there are a lot of problems that I have with Mother 3's story that I think are things other people would have problems with as well if they simply engage with more media outside of video games. Let's start with one of the biggest ones, the Needle Bearers. As characters, they're fine for the most part. However, I don't like that their name contains a slur for the Romani people in it. I'm not blaming Shigesato Itoi for this. A lot of people don't know that word is a slur, considering it was heavily used in a Disney movie, but it's still something that I would hope gets fixed in an updated translation of the game. The more pressing thing about them is the fact that there's a joke when Ionia, one of them, teaches our hero Lucas PSI for the first time through what is implied to be sexual assault. It's essentially just a haha queer people are pedophiles joke, and that really doesn't sit well with me. In a game that is so otherwise progressive, it feels like it was a mistake. I mean, I know for a fact, from interviews, and from how he portrays them in his other work, Itoi really does not hate queer people. He's made that very clear. He's a good guy. so I don't know how something like this made it into the game. My other complaints are a lot less serious than that one, and they have to do with the overall story structure of Mother 3. Mother 3's introduction flip-flops between characters, which is an aspect of it I love. However, it doesn't commit to this. By the 4th chapter, it completely stops doing this. Why? It makes it feel very inconsistent. I think it was a really cool part of the narrative to let you see a bunch of different perspectives, and I'd really like if a game would just commit to that idea. I think this switch from a series of vignettes to a more linear adventure story really hurts the game. Speaking of that linear adventure story, you sure do spend a lot of it doing things that don't really matter. In particular, I'm not too keen on the Thunder Tower dungeon. It feels very arbitrary. Once you get the Egg of Light, you're just forced to go in there and blow it up for no reason by the story. In fact, the whole thing with the Egg of Light in general feels really arbitrary in retrospect. On your first playthrough, it seems like it'll amount to something important, but it's completely dropped. Leader mentions it once in Chapter 8, but it never gets used. That might sound natural, because the entire point of the Egg of Light wasn't to use it, it was to keep it out of the hands of the pigmasks, but it still feels weird that you spend so much time getting this thing and nothing happens with it. If I had written the story, I would have had the pigmasks successfully take the Egg of Light at some point as an early failure, to continue the string of early failures that the people of Tazmily faced. But instead it feels like the game needs to fill itself with a few hours before the hunt for the 7 needles for whatever reason. Maybe to get you more acclimated to the party dynamic? I don't know. At the very least, have the group mention the damn thing or do something with it. Speaking of the hunt for the 7 needles, why is it so long? It's easily the longest stretch of the game and it feels very cramped. I think it could have been spread out more over the course of the game, or at the very least the needles could have been foreshadowed more than the one time you see one in Chapter 2. It's a plot element that feels like it comes out of nowhere, and I don't really like that. Another minor nitpick is Facade reappearing only about an hour of gameplay after you thought he died just so the volcano area can have a boss. I think an original boss for the volcano would have been better because this would save Facade for the New Pork sewers later in the game. A much better surprise reappearance of Facade than him being at the volcano because you've had a significantly longer amount of time to think that he's dead. Finally, the party is just really not interesting in terms of character. I mean, I like Lucas, Flint, and Duster, who are all compelling, but Flint disappears from the story after Chapter 4 and until Chapter 8, and Duster's development ends on Tane Tane Island in Chapter 7 when we get confirmation that his dad did abuse him. He gets a little bit in Leader's speech in Chapter 8, but it's about a version of him before his memory was wiped by the Egg of Light, so it's not really him. Adding to this, the party never really talks to each other or has any interesting connections. It doesn't help that one of the mainstays is a goddamn dog who isn't a character beyond being a cute dog. Kumatora got the worst of this. She has a great design and an interesting premise for a character, but her development ends even before Tane Tane Island. She gets most of her development through dialogue from other characters, and her last point in the story where we learn anything meaningful about her is the Chimera Lab section, where we learn she was raised by the Needle Bearers. However, because they're a stronger cast than the first 2 Mother games, most people brush it off and think they're amazing. My biggest problem with this party, of Lucas, Duster, Kumatora, and Boney, is that they don't really feel like a party. I mean, look at Omori as an example of the opposite. The friends there feel like a real friend group. There are tons of interactions between them to solidify that their friendship is strong. The characters in Mother 3 just feel like an arbitrary group of characters. They don't really have any personal connections other than Lucas and Boney being good friends, and that is actually communicated very well throughout the game, because of how Boney never leaves Lucas's side. But why do they stick together? What personal reason do they have? I mean, logically, yes, it makes sense for them all to team up to save the world, but there's no emotional core to it. I'd have liked to see at least a scene where they discuss this in the story or something, but as it stands, the party just doesn't talk to each other. Mother 3 is a great game. I love it. It's a gorgeously animated and scored story about capitalism's destruction of the world. However, there are many flaws with it, particularly in its story, that I can't really ignore. So I made this video in order to highlight all of the ones that I could think of, as I didn't want to seem hypocritical when I complain about the massive amounts of unabashed praise the game gets on the internet, considering I've made quite a few videos that are just dedicated to talking about how much I like this game on the channel. This has been Arcagent Everlasting, ever critical of things, signing off. Thank you for watching.